get to it. We're going to get through two more speakers. I'm in the blame the media camp as well as the blame ourselves camp, so I think blame is infinite. It's not some finite quality. So people of Ferguson found a way to get in the media that we might want to keep in mind. Robert Fantina is an author, a journalist. He's written extensively about the Israeli occupation, the immorality of U.S. imperialism, the political situation in this country. He's an author of 3 books, wonderful books, by the way, Desertion and the American Soldier, 1776 to 2006. Look Not Unto the Morrow, a Vietnam-era anti-war novel, and his most recent book, Empire, Racism, and Genocide, a history, an honest one obviously, of U.S. foreign policy. He is also a U.S. citizen who moved to Canada when George W. Bush was elected president. And I wouldn't be surprised if Israelis are calling him up for advice right now. Bob Fantina.
Thank you. We've just been schooled a little bit and given some advice. I'm going to give some context that will hopefully motivate us even further to do some of the things that we've been told we need to do. We are told by the U.S. government that we need a huge military in order to protect us from terrorist attacks and to keep the citizens safe, right? That's what we hear all the time. That's why the U.S. military budget this year is $585 billion, larger than the next 8 countries combined. Now, as was mentioned, I moved to Canada 10 years ago, which has a larger landmass than the United States, but our military budget is a fraction of what the U.S. budget is, and yet we are not plagued with terrorist attacks all the time. Few countries in the world are so plagued, but if they are, usually the perpetrators of the United States. But anyway, so the U.S. has this huge budget. In 2001, the military budget in U.S. dollars was $384 million. In 2015 dollars was $384 billion, which is still a huge amount. Not what it is today, but it's still a huge amount. Yet that didn't stop a ragtag group of people from hijacking 4 airliners and crashing into the United States, into different locations in the United States. So, how much does then the military ensure any kind of domestic safety if those huge amounts weren't able to do that? So that's one question. Another question is, why does the U.S. require a budget, military budget, so much larger than any other country in the world? Third, what are the trade-offs for the U.S. for having this huge military budget? What does it give up in order to do that? And what is the impact on world safety of the U.S. having this huge budget? So it might be true that to some degree the U.S. military protects the U.S. from its enemies, but it's also true that the U.S. military creates those enemies, is the cause of those enemies existing. There has been for years tremendous hostility against the U.S. Throughout other countries. The U.S. politicians don't like to talk about that. They talk about only how this is the greatest country in the world, and the reason people hate us is because of our freedoms. We heard that from Mr. Giuliani a number of years ago when he was trying to become president. But is this really the case? Let's look at some examples and see how the U.S. military has or has not made the U.S. a safer place to be. So in 2002, as we all know, the U.S. invaded Iraq, overthrew the government, displaced at least 1 million people, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and destroyed the infrastructure. This was because we were told that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and was poised to use them against the United States. And in order to prevent that, this invasion was required. Of course, many of us knew before that point, and everyone knows now, that there were no weapons of mass destruction. However, let's look a little bit at the history of the U.S. with Iraq. Going back to the 50s, the U.S. supported the regime of Abdul Karim Qasim. Fine. However, in the early 60s, Mr. Qasim was wanting to build up his weaponry in his military machine to rival that of Israel. He also was talking about challenging U.S. dominance in the Middle East. Well, the U.S. couldn't have that, obviously. So it began to arm Kurdish rebels. And in 1963, Mr. Qasim was overthrown and quickly executed. Now, let's not forget that the U.S. was, in 2002, invaded and overthrew Saddam Hussein. So when Mr. Qasim was overthrown in 1963, the U.S., not, of course, going to let Iraq pick their own government. They had a government they were happy with, and the U.S. didn't like that. So they selected the anti-communist Ba'ath Party to replace him. And they worked very closely at that time with a 25-year-old Ba'ath Party member by the name of... There we go, okay. I'm not telling you anything new, right? Okay. So over the years, Iraq fell into disfavor with the U.S. and in the 70s was on a list of state sponsors of terror. Don't get me started on that one. So in with the election of Ronald Reagan, shortly after the election, Iraq was at war with Iran, and the U.S. supported Iraq in this war. So Mr. Reagan took U.S. off the list of state sponsors of terror, and later that year, that was 1982, the Hughes Aircraft Company sent Iraq 60 Defender helicopters. The following year, countries surrounding Iraq that were allies of the U.S. were granted permission by the U.S. to send U.S. equipment into Iraq. So this included howitzers, Huey helicopters, and bombs, all U.S. made, U.S. provided. The following year, the U.S. shipped heavy trucks, armored ambulances, and communications gear to Iraq. Between 1986 and 1989, the U.S. licensed 70 biological exports to Iraq, including 21 batches, at least 21 batches, of lethal strains of anthrax. Also during that time, chemicals used in the manufacture of mustard gas were sent to Iraq. So it was believed by the U.S. that Iraq had chemical weapons, well, at one point they did. In 1992, ABC Nightline News said this. Just bear with me a minute, I'll just look at the quotation. Quote, "It is becoming increasingly clear that George Bush Sr., operating largely behind the scenes throughout the 1980s, initiated and supported much of the financing, intelligence, and military help that built Saddam's Iraq into an aggressive power." The following year, Senator Donald Regal, a Democrat from Michigan, testified before the Senate saying that it was likely that chemical weapons sent to Iraq by the United States were eventually used against U.S. soldiers by Iraq during the Gulf War and were probably a cause of some of the symptoms of Gulf War syndrome. So consider this in the context of the U.S. military keeping the country safer. Okay, so perhaps that was, well anyway, so the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2002 because it believed that it had armaments, training, and chemical weapons. And this was probably because the U.S. had provided it with armaments, training, and chemical weapons. So maybe you might think, I know no one here does, that this was an isolated case. So let's talk about Afghanistan. In 1979, Russia invaded, and the U.S. felt threatened again that its influence was going to be jeopardized in that area. The Shah of Iran had been overthrown not too long before that, and now there was a problem of more Russian dominance in that area, the challenge. So the U.S., which had, under President Carter, stopped sending any support to Pakistan, under Reagan, the U.S. started supporting Pakistan again, and noticed that Islamic extremists were working with Pakistan and also were fighting the rebels in Afghanistan that were fighting Russia. So let me just clarify that. The U.S. took notice of Pakistan, but then saw the same thing was happening in Afghanistan, that Islamic holy warriors were fighting the Russians. So they decided that there were a lot of advantages in providing armaments to these Islamic extremists. One, it kept the military industry happy in the United States because there was a market, another market for their weaponry. But also it supported the foreign policy goal of keeping U.S. influence strong in that area. So the Islamic extremists did succeed with U.S. weaponry and training in driving Russia out of Afghanistan, but like Iraq earlier, they weren't willing to accept a U.S. government selected a leader for them. So it's kind of making a long story short, but eventually they morphed into the Taliban. And while we're here today, the U.S. is fighting them in the longest war in U.S. history. So there we go, another use of militarism to keep the U.S. safer, and it's called the 14-year war. So the hostility toward the U.S. is very strong right now in the Middle East, and one reason for that, I mentioned two, but a third is the U.S.'s unqualified and unconditional support for Israel. This year alone, U.S. financial support for Israel will exceed $3 billion. It's the most money it's the largest chunk of foreign aid that goes to any country goes to Israel, which then uses it to carpet bomb the Gaza Strip periodically, to kidnap, kill, arrest without charge, and hold without charge Palestinians in the West Bank. Now the U.S. claims that they have to do this because Israel is their only friend, is the U.S.'s only ally, real ally in the Middle East. Well, let's think for a minute. If the U.S. were a little more equitable in the distribution of its foreign aid to that country, and used it for humanitarian purposes rather than for killing, well, the U.S. might then have a few more friends in the Middle East. But despite Israel's dismal human rights record, that support continues. Now, we have seen a little crack in that recently, which I'm very happy about, and we'll see where that goes. So let's go back to another one of the U.S.'s imperial misadventures, which we're all familiar with, Vietnam. Now, the U.S. got involved in Vietnam as early as the 1950s after France, which was trying desperately to hold on to that as a colony, lost a major battle. They pulled away. But the U.S. could not allow Vietnam to unite under a communist government. So the U.S. spent on at least $980 billion in 2015 money on that war. During that time, some companies that manufacture consumer goods switched to manufacturing military goods, which caused a decrease in consumer spending, which caused some inflation and higher interest rates, as the expenditures in the war, which brought about deficits, also caused economic problems. So in the 1960s, the U.S. went from a growth economy to, in the 1970s, economic crisis. So socially, the war caused tremendous rifts in the United States, lots of dissension on campuses. The Watergate scandal let people see the government a little more realistically and greatly damaged government credibility, which was certainly a good thing, and led to the resignation of a president, the only time in history that's happened. Also, as we know, there were over 58,000 Americans died, and somewhere between 2 and 4 million Vietnamese were killed. These are numbers that are so huge. I mean, I can't really conceive of them. I mean, that's just so many people that were killed in that, and it did nothing to ensure U.S. interests, to help the U.S. be safer, but the military industries in the U.S. were certainly booming at that time. Okay, so there's been a lot of talk today about drones. The U.S. is very proud of its capability to kill people with drones. The pilots aren't in any jeopardy. They sit in an office somewhere and push buttons and people die, right? So, and of course, the government assures us that they're only killing bad guys, except for that collateral damage. On April 24th of 2013, young Yemeni, Fareya al-Muslimi, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing his name incorrectly, testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights. He had attended high school in the United States, and his neighbors in his community had a very positive impression of the United States because of that. But he said this during his testimony, quote, "Now, however, when they think of America, they think of the fear they feel at the drones over their heads. What the violent militants have failed to achieve, one drone strike accomplished in an instant." He also said that there had been a recent drone strike where there was some alleged terrorist was identified, and that was who the U.S. wanted to get. He said everyone in the town knew who that person was. The U.S. could have come in, say, yeah, it's him over there, and could have been captured. But instead, the U.S. chose to use drone strikes, killed that person and several other people. In 2009, in what was believed to be President Obama's first authorized drone strike, 14 women and 21 children were killed as they wanted to get one person. So it is believed that one person who died in that had some connection to Al-Qaeda. Well, let's look at those numbers for a minute. At least 5,000 people have been killed in drone strikes in the last 10 years or so. So if out of 35 people killed, one is a terrorist, let's leave for a moment the morality of killing anybody. Just put that aside for a moment as much as we can. But assuming that there's some justification in killing terrorists and putting aside, suspending reality for a minute. But if 5,000 people have been killed, and if we can average one suspected criminal is killed out of every 35, that means out of 5,000 people killed, 142 are targeted. So it's a huge, huge number of, quote, collateral damage. Collateral damage is such a nice term. What does it mean? Something's broken, thrown out. These are people, these are human beings that are being killed. Okay, a couple more quotations. A Yemeni lawyer tweeted this in 2012, quote, "Dear Mr. Obama, when a U.S. drone missile kills a child in Yemen, the father will go to war with you, guaranteed. Nothing to do with Al-Qaeda." So these drones, how are they making us safer? How is military making us safer? The same year, Ibrahim Mothana, a young Yemeni writer, said this in a New York Times op-ed. Quote, "Drone strikes are causing more and more Yemenis to hate America and join radical militants. They are not driven by ideology, but rather by a sense of revenge and despair." End of quote. So where is the advantage? Where is the advantage of drone strikes? What is that doing for anybody? Certainly for the United States. So, does the military exist to protect the U.S. and the gift of self-determination to oppressed people? That's what we're always told, right? However, we know that's not the case. Let's go one more example. In the mid-1980s, the U.S. government, in violation of its own laws, was selling arms to Iran in order to support an insurgency in Nicaragua. You all remember that, right? So why would little Nicaragua, which doesn't have oil as far as I know, why would it come to the attention of the U.S.? That's an interesting question. Now, Oxfam, an international development organization, made a comment about Nicaragua that may explain things. Quote, "Nicaragua was exceptional in the strength of that government's commitment to improving the condition of the people and encouraging their active participation in the development process." Now, the Nicaraguan government came to power not long before, after overthrowing Somoza, who had a brutal regime for 10 years that was completely U.S. supported. But it seems the U.S. would rather have the people of Nicaragua suffer under a right-wing government than prosper under a left-wing government. One of the big issues in Vietnam was that no U.S. president could allow a country to fall to communism under their watch. So I think we're kind of at the same kind of a theme. Someone asked, what about the soldiers, the men and women the U.S. sends to do this dirty work? Now, the last panel discussion, which was extremely moving, talked about that in some detail. But during the Vietnam War, Colonel Robert Heinl recorded in the Armed Forces Journal this. He said, quote, "The morale, discipline, and battle worthiness of U.S. Armed Forces are, with a few salient exceptions, lower and worse than at any time in this century and possibly in the history of the United States, close quote. Soldiers came home from Vietnam and either fathered or gave birth to children with extreme physical handicaps and fought for years to get the government to recognize what the medical profession had long since recognized, and that's that the chemicals used in Agent Orange, the defoliant used in Vietnam, was the cause of those birth defects. A generation later, soldiers came home from the Gulf War and again fought an unwilling government to get the Gulf War syndrome recognized. And even today, services for post-traumatic stress, and we talked in the last meeting about not calling that a disorder, but recognition of that is grudging at best. Also, veterans today have a higher rate of homelessness, drug addiction, alcoholism, divorce, and suicide than the general population. An average, according to government statistics, of 22 veterans kill themselves every day. Veterans organizations say that the amount is really at least in the 30s. So this is just unspeakably tragic. So this is what militarism brings. International violence and global instability are perhaps the most visible symptoms of the disease of militarism, but it does take a highly personal toll as well. And that's why we're here today, to learn more and to, this week, to tell Congress and the President that we've had enough and that we won't stop until the war is abolished. Thank you.